When you have a fifth of the world's oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz, that's going to topple world economies in ways we cannot predict.
Mondays with Mike.
Mondays with Mike. Mondays with Mike.
So, in the past 2 weeks, since the recording of our last podcast, we have been plunged into what is doubtless the biggest military conflagration that the United States has been involved in since the Iraq War. The United States has taken on the government of Iran. While there is little doubt that we outclass them in terms of military hardware, military budget, the training of our personnel, it is pretty much without doubt that in a head-to-head military conflict we would win given time. The events of the last 2 weeks demonstrate that these things aren't so transparent from the outset, how it's going to go. Iran, about 40 or more of the leaders of Iran were killed in the opening minutes of the conflict. Very true. But the regime manages to maintain a semblance of strategy and hit us and the globe where it hurts, I don't know the most, but hurts substantially, which is with oil. Iran has attacked at least 3 ships, according to NBC, and my take is, although obviously the targeting of civilian infrastructure, etc., is unacceptable behavior, bombing the civilians, don't do it, like, it's obvious why they're doing it. Like, they're doing it, the mullahs, because they know that unless they can get the U.S. to quit fairly soon, their regime is doomed, and there probably is little to no future for them. Certainly not in any government, if even alive, although I think most of them would actually survive as people, frankly. But one doesn't know. And so, have I summarized that okay? Have I left stuff out? What do you think?
No, you summarized it pretty well. The big things right now is Iran has no effective air force, no effective navy.
Yeah.
That Israel and the U.S. have what's called air superiority pretty much over the skies of Iran and control the ocean, the waterways for the most part. Except the one exception is those mine boats, those little tiny boats, because the mines can be done asymmetrically. So the issue with the mines is that that Iran can fight with them one or two at a time on little fishing boats. That technically they could hide it with thousands of little boats and just drop one or two mines here and there. And it's like looking for a needle in a haystack when you're talking about 1,000 miles of coastline in terms of where the Straits of Hormuz are located compared to Iran. The big issue, and we talked about this in the last episode, is that right now Iran's choices are very limited in terms of how they can fight. They've got a significant ground force. They have guns, right? They have people who can pew pew, fire, and shoot, but they can't really fight anyone if there's no one to fight on the ground right now because it's an air war and ships. But what they can do is asymmetric warfare. So
Yeah.
that's what this particular kind of war is now. It's a war of attrition. So Iran, because it operates as a sort of absolutist theocratic dictatorship, meaning there's no real consent of the governed involved in terms of the population, so long as they maintain their stranglehold on power, they can outlast the Western world in terms of the political system they have. Because the Western world, its both strength and weakness is that it's got democratic institutions and they're accountable to the people. And the issue right now is that when you have a fifth of the world's oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz, that's going to topple world economies in ways we cannot predict or know about.
Yeah, I read that it would actually be worse than the oil shock of the 1970s.
For sure. And it's because the issue is that there is oil. We just have no way to get it out, right? And that's why you have all these companies declaring force majeure and shutting down their contracts, because it's an act of God. They cannot deliver on the promises and commitments they've made because they can't get it out without risking losing their very expensive ships that carry huge volumes of oil. But that's not just the only issue here. Half of a certain type of fertilizer in the world is exported through the Straits of Hormuz. So we're talking about
Mm,
food prices. Now, I'm not sure that the Trump administration really looked at history when they looked at the causes of war, which happen to be food, water, access to oil. Okay? So if fertilizer, a significant amount of which travels through the Strait of Hormuz, can't get out, you're going to see serious supply issues with food. And if the price of food goes up, there are serious problems related to domestic stability because you have protests, riots in the street. People work to support their families, to have shelter, to pay for food, to have the general amenities of life. And right now, this one thing, the Strait of Hormuz, is affecting gas prices and it's going to affect food prices. And it's affecting food prices in two ways. The first is fertilizer, which is significantly important for maintaining high volumes of food output through agriculture. And then the other is oil prices. The reason oil prices affect food prices has to do with transportation, right? So if you don't have enough oil to go around, you don't have enough gas at cost for your ships, your trains, your planes, your trucks. And remember, Iran is 93 million in the world, but the world's billions of people, and when you're talking at the numbers we're talking about, a fifth of the world's oil supply, a third of the fertilizer, we're talking World War III levels of conflict if this doesn't get resolved. So what I do think is going to happen is that you're going to have a coalition show up like they did for the Red Sea against the Houthis, where
yeah.
you're going to have a lot of countries start engaging in minesweeping. They're going to start engaging in either a total naval blockade or air blockade of Iran. And it's going to be pretty dramatic, I think, because the economy, the world economy is very, it seems strong, but it's very fragile. We saw this during the Carter administration, but also during the Great Depression, is that if you, especially for food, so if the food supply doesn't stay stable, there's going to be serious fights over access to whatever food is available,
Wow.
land. But there's also another issue. No, so the other issue has to do with water.
Yeah.
So if there is anything that stops this war, it's going to be access to fresh water for Iran. If their
Mm,
desalinization plants get hit, they have a real issue with getting access to fresh water. Then the other issue would just be if there's pressures within the country. I'm not so sure that the pressures within the country will be significant enough to overthrow the regime because,
mm-hmm.
again, it is a religious, absolutist, theocratic regime. It's not the all these calls from Israel and the U.S. to the Iranian people to overthrow the country miss a pretty straightforward point that the people who would be doing the overthrowing don't have enough guns. They don't have enough weapons, period. They don't have access to the sort of tools they would need to actually overthrow the regime in any meaningful way. And
Mm-hmm.
so they can bomb as many security checkpoints as they want, as many roads, as many bridges. They just don't have the numbers. That part of the issue straight up with as far as my read on this from what I can see of publicly released data is that in order for there to be a regime change at the level they're talking about, they would have to have access to communication, which I'm not so sure they have because Iran controls the internet, and they would have to have access to arms, to weapons. I'm not so sure they have that because Iran's got extreme, as many dictatorships do, has extreme levels of gun control over who gets access to the weapons. And if you read about the history of what happened with the last, I don't know, 50 years of the Islamic Republic in terms of how they've established their internal security, is that the Iranian Republic, the Guard, the armed force, the main armed force of Iran, established caches of weapons all around the country so that they would never have a shortage at any given place within the country of needing to transport guns and ammo from place to place. That they're essentially they could each, it's severable, as in each of these different regions could defend themselves of the military power that's in place,
Mm,
absent any kind of need for a central command to intervene. And so that creates this real difficulty because when you have something like guerrilla warfare or you have something like a civil war, there has to be an ability within of the populace to actually fight. And it's not so clear that exists. And it's very not clear that the US or Israel have actually used clandestine means to bring weapons and technology to the people who would fight. And so let's say I'm very skeptical of the claim that this war is going to be done in a week, a month, a year. Because remember that Iran's a country that had an 8-year war with Iraq. And at one point, when they started running out of the various weapons they had, they started just using waves of people, just waves of people against tanks and bullets and missiles and guns. If a country is willing to do that in terms of it fighting against its neighbor, in what it viewed as an existential threat. Same deal here. I don't see, unless the regime gets toppled completely, it could, right? It could happen. What we don't see is the clandestine stuff. That if there is a secret war going on, we don't see that. We don't see fighting that goes on in the buildings. We don't see the fighting that's going on in terms of if there's the equivalent of ninjas, right? If we have spies placed around the country that are sabotaging things, we don't see any of that, and we shouldn't. I hope we never do in the media because we will see we talked about this. We'll see the effects of it, like we saw in Venezuela, right? Because there was someone on the inside in Venezuela apparently that helped the United States capture Maduro and seize him and take him out of the country. Something similar could happen here that we're not going to see until it happens. I wouldn't put that. Yeah, I wouldn't put that past Israel being able to do that because Israel's infamous for being able to successfully target people and defeat them.
Yeah, much like how Strait of Hormuz, you could have predicted that in terms of what their general strategy would be, but evidently it was, as far as we know, not taken into consideration. We see the oil prices. They went way up, over $100 a barrel, and so we weren't ready for that, and I don't think we're ready for an extended conflict if they remained able to assault ships going through the Strait of Hormuz in terms of the fertilizer that we would lack, because we need that to feed people. Just as when your survival depends on it, you get pretty creative, and in their mind, their survival depends on it, so they've found a way to hit us where it hurts. So hopefully we find some other way, and hopefully not too terribly destructive a way, to bring this to a satisfactory close that doesn't result in starvation. Trump says things like, we could, within an hour, hit them in certain ways where you could never rebuild back that country. And I think to myself, I really hope that does not happen. I really hope that he does not do that, because then you have, I don't just want to say an enemy forever, but currently it seems to me like everybody's going to look at Trump in particular and think, they really got us into this one. Or they might look at the Likud party and say, now we're in it. But they'll also say, because countries are condemning Iran. I don't know condemning what exactly it was, but it was like 145 countries or so voted against something they were doing. So although it's like, we know who the bull in the china shop was, we should make sure to act as little belligerent as possible, as contained as possible, away as we can. And so they're releasing from the strategic petroleum reserves in the world, but that's only about 4 days worth of oil. And I think we've covered what happens if attacks on shipping continue. And I think that probably as far as the safety to international commerce goes, and the international agriculture production that flows from it, that a coalition, sort of an emergency coalition, of as many of the countries in the world as possible is in order, and the sooner the better. And then one other thing, the Strait of Hormuz is very narrow. What if we could do a railroad from like Kuwait to other places? If it's that or no fertilizer, you might actually need to do it, frankly. So, do you think a coalition is in order? And do you think that some kind of diplomatic off ramp could be offered to the people who make up the regime currently?
A coalition, I think, is going to happen because Iran attacked a whole bunch of different countries. I think more than one, and countries ultimately have a duty to protect their own people. And so I think a coalition is on the way. That the U.S. and Israel aren't going to go this alone. That these countries don't like being attacked and having their entire economic infrastructure jeopardized and threatened. That they have to shut down their airspace or that they have to limit their ability to participate in the world economy. And so I do think there's going to be a real effort to rein in Iran's whatever you want to call it control of the Strait of Hormuz. That there's only so many ships and so many mines that Iran can feasibly place into the waterways. At some point, right, there's going to be enough of a resistance to that to make the Strait of Hormuz safe again. But in terms of the diplomatic off ramp, it's really not clear that the leadership of Iran would take that kind of opportunity because, again, this is an absolutist religious theocracy. This may be the only point of these people's lives where they have this level of power, that they have this level of say over the lives of this many people, millions of people. And if you look at history, there's a long record of religious dictatorships and theocracies going to the bitter end that there is no diplomatic off ramp for them because they don't want to leave, that they want to hold on to their grasp of power however much they can until they die. And part of the issue, I think, is that this is a culture of martyrdom. So it's one thing if it's Venezuela, was a country where the leadership they were already having a power struggle, and it was very clear that it was money driven, right? That their incentives, their motives weren't necessarily like fidelity to the cause, some like religious fervor and dogmatic devotion to some ideal or thing. No, they had power, they have power to make money and to engage in what I'll charitably call flagrant corruption. In Iran, on the other hand, it's not so clear that money is the motivator, right? It really isn't clear that money is a motivation at all, other than its use to control the population. That this is very much an ideologically driven movement, and it not in some like fanciful way of some utopian kind of thing. No, like hardline super oppression of a religious absolute theocracy, as in they dictate how people live their lives, period. And any kind of foreign intervention into that kind of dictating of people's lives is viewed as a, how do I explain this? It's viewed as an attack on the faith itself, right? So it's not that they're motivated by what you might call regular incentives, like living a long, fruitful life, pursuing happiness and freedom and all that. No, that their identities are intertwined with this religious control over the country and this absolutism that they want to impose on the country, that they will go down with the ship, right? That's why it looks like they chose the son of the former supreme leader who just lost his wife and dad in the first day of the attacks. That signals, at least to me, from my political science hat, that they're not backing down. That this is a religious dogmatic fervor, right? That there are ideological reasons for why they're going to keep fighting, even if the fighting ends up being mano a mano, hand to hand, right? Fighting with whatever tools they have at their disposal. It's not going to be great in terms of if you think about in history of the countries that had this level of ideological fervor. I'm thinking Japan in World War II, right? That the fear was that if the United States didn't use the biggest, baddest weapon it could find to shock Japan into giving up, that they were going to fight to the death, that they were not going to give up, that they were going to fight to the last person to defend their sort of religious devotion to their god emperor. Yeah, so the point I'm making is I think the Trump administration heavily underestimated the Iranian regime. There seems to be a limited level of understanding of that particular section of the world, that these countries, specifically Iran, religion is very much their motivating factor. It's not money. Power, yes, but power in service of the religious belief. That's why we saw what happened in Afghanistan, right? Like they waited out for 20 years. The Taliban waited out the conflict, and now they're back in power, and they're imposing their extreme religious ideologies and beliefs on that country. So we could put boots on the ground. We can bomb them. We can engage in a naval blockade. We could cut off their money. We could cut off their technology. It's not going to stop it unless there's an actual change within their religious understanding of what's motivating this conflict. And I don't see that kind of effort happening at all. As in, there's no real cultural change that's happening in Iran in terms of their religious beliefs or understanding of the world. If anything, what the U.S. did is going to generate more anger at the United States because the supreme leader wasn't just the political leader, he was their religious leader. And religion is the one hot coal in international politics that's very tough to not get burned by when you try to engage in any kind of diplomacy, any kind of like compromise, is that look, the Trump administration fired an awful lot of people early on with that Doge effort, and the question I have is, did they fire anybody who was an expert on Iran? Did they fire anybody who's an expert on religion? Did they fire it? Because if they go in blind, right, with their limited military objectives, they can take out the entire military of Iran, all the apparatus. They could take out all the planes. They could take out all the boats. They could disarm the whole country. That's still 93 million people that they have to figure out where to put them in the world if they destabilize the country. We're talking about the largest refugee crisis that the world's seen since, I don't know, maybe when India and Pakistan thought there was a pretty big refugee crisis, the Nigerian Civil War.
Syria?
Syria, yeah, Syria was a pretty bad refugee crisis. Venezuela was a pretty bad refugee crisis. But those pale in order of magnitude if you're talking about 90 plus million people trying to run away from the country if this all goes sideways. Because it's not clear that there's anybody within the country that can actually stabilize the country when you're talking about millions of religious ideologues. It's not clear. Even if you look at the protests, they were a fraction of a percent of the people of the country protesting, and thousands got shot and killed in the streets because no one had a means to defend themselves. So it's not as if, even if millions of people rise up, it's not as if they could win. That's the problem. They don't have the guns. They don't have the bullets.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very difficult situation, of course. We wouldn't just sit around. I don't know. I'm not some kind of grand military strategist. What I'm definitely thinking is we wouldn't permit the strait to be blocked any longer than we had to. If oil was at $200 or $300, we'd get the troops and we'd occupy the area around the strait if we needed to. But beyond that, I would bet that our engagement will stop if there's nothing we can do, and they're like, they got us in terms of shipping, we have to. But that Trump would be extremely reticent to accept that. But then, if he went overboard, that he would then get voted out. So he would consider that as well. Yeah, I guess that the point is that if the Mullah regime has nothing to do but stay in power because they've made their lives through oppression, and that's the only way that they can continue their lives, and their faithful are motivated by a religious ideology, then that's very difficult. I don't know. I say to myself, but you had to kill thousands of people to stay in power, so is that really... But I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to go there in terms of think through your convictions.
There was a way that the Trump administration could have done this that would have had a lot more international support. So when Iran decided to kill thousands of protesters in the streets, that opened a door for international intervention from the Security Council through a humanitarian intervention. That the argument could be made that it was a violation of the UN Charter and that the UN Security Council and the countries needed to intervene because it's not correct for a country to gun down its own citizens in the streets. And sovereignty fundamentally depends on recognition from other sovereign countries of the sovereign's power to operate within that country. And so there was a pathway diplomatically to make it more like the first Gulf War. So in the first Gulf War, there was a huge coalition of countries to stop Iraq from invading Kuwait, right? Iraq wanted to go into Kuwait, take the oil fields, control the oil there, and H.W. Bush said nope, and it got a whole bunch of countries to all join together and stop that. And it was a very limited military objective. They went in, they pushed Iraq out, they left, right? Same kind of deal here. The Trump administration could have tried to get an actual coalition of countries to go in, separate the regime from its power, right? The people with the guns, they could have tried to disarm them and instituted some kind of reform there. Instead, we have what happened here, which was very shock and awe, right? A lot of bombs, a very effective military outcome in terms of dismantling the military apparatus of Iran. But the political realities haven't really changed in Iran. The people who might overthrow the country still don't have the guns and the power. And the people who don't want to be overthrown still have a significant enough level of power over the media and the political system that they can control it. So it's a mess. So what happened in
Yeah.
Venezuela makes a lot more sense now if the Trump administration was planning all along to go attack Iran. Because remember, Venezuela has the largest supply of untapped crude oil reserves in the world. And if the Straits of Hormuz are shut down for the foreseeable future, then one viable off ramp in the next 5, 10, 20 years to still gaining control over the world's oil is to heavily develop Venezuela's oil supplies and put those to use. Because there's a lot more ways out of Venezuela if you look geographically on a map of getting oil from where it is to where it needs to be to refine it. Because the Straits of Hormuz is a bottleneck, right? It's a waterway that is only limited to one passage. It's very narrow and it's heavily dependent on the geopolitical realities of the time. What's going on in Venezuela is much different, and that creates an opportunity. If you really look at the map of where the oil is in the world, that creates a real opportunity to expand the oil supply to the benefit of the Western Hemisphere away from a dependence on Middle Eastern oil, because obviously the Middle East is a quagmire. It's a huge, complicated place that has, let's call it, unpredictable elements involved that make it not reliable for the world economy to depend on. If a fifth of the world economy can fall apart and crumble so easily because of one country with a limited number of mines and ships at its disposal, that's a real quandary, right? Because ostensibly, the stability of some of these other countries in the world that are much bigger than Iran, we're talking India, we're talking China, these countries that heavily relied on the oil from this part of the world from the Strait of Hormuz. Because it's a bit, it's not misleading, but it doesn't fully capture the issue when you talk about 20% of the world's oil. Because out of that 20%, some countries are much higher in terms of the percentage of that percent that they rely on for oil and fertilizer and natural gas. Much higher. We're talking 50%, 60%, 70% of their oil is specifically from the Straits of Hormuz. And so when we talk about global stability, how do you stop wars from breaking out? This is one way. You keep the oil flowing, you keep the fertilizer flowing so that starving people don't fight over the available arable land and the food stores and access to cheap gas. But it's also a feedback loop, right? So if the price of gas goes higher, the price of food also goes higher because it costs more to get it from where it is to the markets that you would sell the food from. And it just keeps escalating from there, right? That if the price of fertilizer goes up and the price of gas goes up, then the price of food can go significantly higher. And so when Trump's going, oh, there's no affordability crisis, there's going to be an affordability crisis before the midterms. Gas is going to go up, the price of everything else is going to go up, and he's still trying to impose tariffs on everything. And so I don't see, just from basic arithmetic, I don't see a path where the price of anything goes down right now. It's all going to go up, up.
Yeah, unless they have something up their sleeve, which they deploy pretty fast. We didn't know this was going to happen. We didn't know Venezuela was going to happen. But for now, here's hoping.
So we were in the middle of negotiations with Iran, and then Iran got attacked. And the issue from Iran's perspective, as far as I can tell, is that even if they were offered a diplomatic off ramp, or if they were offered some kind of negotiation to surrender, although Trump's saying it needs to be an unconditional surrender, which I'm skeptical. But even if they were offered a diplomatic offer, from the Iranian perspective, it's not so clear that they'll believe the olive branch when it's offered. Because the last time they were in the middle of negotiations, they got attacked. Like, from their perspective, their back is against a wall and they're not offered any exits out. It's fight or flight, and right now there is no flight. There's just fight. Unless they do something like give them an opportunity to go into exile. So they could go to Russia, like Assad did for exile. And that's one way to get a regime out. It's not so clear that, again, that the higher echelon of the regime even wants to leave. That for some of them, this is it. This is the pinnacle of their political and religious success that they will ever have within their little corner of the world. This is it. This is the peak. And for some people, they don't want to leave the top of the mountain. They want to be lording it over even their little fraction of percent of the world population. It's 1%, I think, of the world population. But it's their 1% of the world population. Some people cling to power.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like they've been preparing their entire professional lives, perhaps for some of the younger ones, their entire lives, for just such an apocalyptic to them moment. And it's just so awful. But okay, it is what it is. Now, and by the way, if they wanted to do exile so that we could stop the fighting and the bloodshed, and they wanted to do exile, I would say I'm in favor of that. I would say let them, personally. But they don't want to do it, but if they did, I'd say let them, personally.
This is where diplomacy matters a great deal, where you have back channel talking conversations, where you have actual diplomats engaged in actual discussions. There's what we see, and then there's the whole behind the scenes thing that's going on of these countries talking to each other. And it's completely bizarre if you read any of the books of diplomats of some of these negotiations that happen, of just how completely different they are from the reality we see of the public facade. Because ultimately, these are people, right? Even if they have religious control, they're still, at least some of them, amenable to the idea of not getting bombed to oblivion. There's got to be someone in the Iranian regime that wants to leave. Look, people don't get to choose where they're born. They don't get to choose the societies they grow up in necessarily, or the religions that they're indoctrinated into.
Right.
But they do have a choice now. They have a choice in this moment to stay or to go. I disagree with what Hegseth was saying in the press conference of no quarter and no mercy. One, because it's a war crime. But two, if you don't offer people an opportunity to surrender, then it limits the options that we as a country have in terms of how to wind down this conflict. Look, if they think there is no option, if there is no surrender, they will fight to the very last second, right? Why wouldn't they? If it's their life, if it's life and death for them.
Exactly. There's nothing to lose. If you're gonna die, you would just keep fighting. There's this lady, professor at the Naval War College and a big time podcaster, Sarah Pine, and she says, don't put the enemy on death ground. Don't put your enemy in a place where they have nowhere to run to, nowhere to escape. Because that is the enemy that will fight the hardest, because they have nothing to do left but to fight. So people, frankly, I hear a lot of perspectives on this, and a lot of the perspectives I don't expect. Anything from what's really going on, can you explain this to me, to Trump's the real criminal here, to things are really going to go well for the world in about a year. This might be rough, but things are really going to go well for the world in about a year. And I do hear from some of the people, and especially like the Iranians are finally going to have their lives back. But I just think to myself, growing up, as we did, with the Iraq conflict, as young as I was, I thought, we can obviously take down Iraq. We take down the bad guy, Saddam's a bad guy, and then we put a good guy in, and it was not that simple. And it did not go like that. And we were there for a decade. And over a decade from there, we got ISIS. we got a worse evil. Saddam's pretty bad guy, but we got a religiously motivated evil that came out of that vacuum. So, in a certain way, it's like we're the most powerful country in the world, but let us be a wise country too, and just let us consider the many, because I didn't know what any of these conflicts were. You could have told me, oh yeah, oil price, that'll go up, but oh look, the Strait of Hormuz, there's really 2 channels in it. There's really one way in, one way out. Didn't know that. There's just there's unfathomable amounts of knowledge that we will just never be privy to because we don't have the time as a human brain to think about all of it. Mondays with Mike.